Stop scrolling. Because before the silence, there was noise, endless screaming noise that filled the galaxy for 846 straight days. The kind of noise that never truly stops, even when the weapons cool. Sirens echoing through hollow stations. Emergency alarms burned into memory. The distant thud of orbital bombardments felt more than heard, like a second heartbeat replacing your own. Entire star systems learned to sleep in fragments, counting survival in minutes instead of nights. This war did not begin with hatred. It began with certainty, the belief that one side was right and the other was wrong, and that force would settle the difference quickly. It didn't. By the time day 847 arrived, no one remembered the original reason for the fighting. The Orion Coalition called it defense. The Varan Dominion called it order. Survivors simply called it never-ending. Worlds changed names. Some vanished completely. Space lanes once crowded with trade convoys became corridors of wreckage. Ships drifted without power, their hulls torn open, frozen crews still strapped into seats where they had died mid-command. Every few hours, someone discovered another planet stripped bare, its surface glassed, its oceans evaporated, its sky permanently stained with ash. The war had stopped being about winning. It had become about enduring longer than the other side. Commanders aged years and months. Soldiers fought until the concept of after disappeared. Children grew up learning which alarms meant hide and which meant pray. And then something strange happened. For the first time since the war began, a full combat cycle passed without escalation. No new offensives were announced. No retaliatory strikes followed. Recon drones reported fleets holding position instead of advancing. Veterans felt it immediately, that uneasy moment when noise pauses, not because danger is gone, but because something worse might be deciding whether to arrive. At 3:17 Standard Galactic Time, on day 847, the emergency network lit up. Every screen, every channel, every listening post. A new signal had entered the system. Not Orion, not Varan. A third identifier, previously irrelevant to the war logs, suddenly ranked as priority absolute. Humanity. At first, many assumed it was an error. Humans were known, of course they were, but they were distant, fragmented, politically chaotic by galactic standards. They traded, explored, argued among themselves. They studied wars more than they fought them. They were observers, not participants. So when a message appeared, many officers didn't even read it right away. It looked too plain, too short. No emblems, no declarations. Just 4 words, transmitted simultaneously across all active war channels. We are entering now. No one cheered. No one panicked. They waited for the rest. It didn't come. Seconds passed. Then minutes. Then the unsettling realization spread across command decks and war rooms alike. That was the entire message. Some laughed nervously. Others cursed. A few veterans felt their stomachs tighten. Not from fear, but from instinct. Short messages in wartime were never casual. They were final. Across the Orion Coalition, exhausted leaders debated what it meant. Was this an alliance offer? A warning? A bluff meant to force negotiations? Across the Varan Dominion, admirals dismissed it outright. Humans had no stake here. No border claims. No ancient grudges. No reason to bleed for someone else's exhausted cause. And yet, the signal remained. Timestamp locked. Origin verified. Human fleets had crossed into the outer edges of the conflict zone. Still, nothing happened. No dramatic arrival. No massive energy signatures. No weapon discharge. Just quiet. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Then frightening. On frontier stations, sensors began picking up movement. Not fast, not aggressive, but deliberate. Ships entering at control velocities, without the violent gravitational scars typical of military jumps. Navigation systems flagged them as non-standard constructs. That alone was alarming. Military ships are designed to announce power. Humans seem to design theirs to avoid attention. Civilians watching emergency broadcasts noticed something even stranger. For the first time in nearly 3 years, anchors had nothing to interrupt them with. No breaking alerts. No casualty updates. The scrolling death counters paused. In orbit over the shattered world of Keth 9, two opposing fleets, locked in a standoff that had lasted 17 days, received identical system alerts at the same moment. Weapons, standby unavailable. Acceleration limits, restricted. Targeting assistance, offline. Pilots thought it was sabotage. Engineers thought it was system failure. Then the message appeared again, identical in tone, impossible to misinterpret. Operation window, 5 hours. No threats. No countdown. No explanation. Just a time frame. That was when fear finally arrived. Not loud, not explosive, but cold and precise. Because wars don't pause unless someone powerful enough decides they can afford to wait. Across the battlefield, veterans noticed a sensation they couldn't quite describe. Space felt different. Not heavier, not brighter, just resistant. Like trying to move underwater after a lifetime in air. A Varan strike cruiser attempted a routine course correction. Its engines responded. Its velocity did not. The ship drifted forward a few kilometers, then slowed, as if an invisible hand had pressed against its hull. Power readings spiked. Systems strained. The universe itself seemed to say, no further. Word spread fast. Not panic, yet but disbelief. On Orion worlds, people stepped outside for the first time in months and realized the sky wasn't burning. No contrails of falling debris. No emergency sirens. Just stars, unmoving, watching. By the end of the first hour, something unprecedented occurred. Across thousands of systems, across enemies who had sworn to annihilate each other, a single shared experience took hold. Nothing was happening, and nothing could be made to happen. No attacks, no counterattacks, no desperate last stands. Only 5 hours of enforced stillness. And in that silence, commanders, soldiers, and civilians alike were forced to confront a truth the war had drowned out. Without constant violence, they didn't know who they were anymore. At hour 2, philosophers would later say, the war began to die, not from defeat, but from irrelevance. At hour 3, the galaxy realized this silence was not a pause. It was a decision, and somewhere, far from the screams and fire, humanity was working quietly, methodically, without speeches, without celebration. As if this was not a miracle. As if this was simply a task that had waited long enough to be completed. The stars did not explode. They listened. And for the first time since the war began, the galaxy understood something terrifying and beautiful at the same time. The loudest moment in history was not an attack. It was 5 hours of silence, and the knowledge that someone had finally learned how to make the universe hold its breath. No one in the Orion Coalition wanted to say the words out loud. But every war room, every command deck, every exhausted strategist was thinking the same thing. We're running out of time. By day 847, Orion wasn't losing in one dramatic collapse. Orion was losing the slow way, the way a body loses blood. Not all at once, but steadily, quietly, until one day you stand up and realize you become too weak to fight back. Their shipyards still produce hulls, yes, but the metal came from scrap. Their fuel depots still held reserves, but those reserves were rationed like medicine. Their pilots still flew missions, but the newest recruits had fewer flight hours than Orion veterans used to log in a single week. Meanwhile, the Varan Dominion grew stronger precisely because the war had become routine. The Dominion didn't fight with passion. They fought with process. They rotated crews. They replaced losses. They advanced like a machine that never needed sleep. The Orion Coalition had relied on hope for too long. Hope that another ally would join. Hope that the Dominion would overextend. Hope that a breakthrough would appear. But hope doesn't repair engines. Hope doesn't refill ammunition. Hope doesn't pull survivors out of vacuum. On day 46, Orion's last major defensive line nearly snapped. A Dominion spearhead cut through a shipping lane and destroyed 3 Orion carriers before reinforcements could even jump in. The coalition barely stabilized the front by sacrificing 2 outpost worlds, worlds that were never supposed to be sacrificed. After that, Orion Command stopped using words like victory. They started using words like delay and containment. That night, in a sealed chamber deep within the Coalition's central station, Orion's top leaders held a meeting that felt more like a confession than strategy. Their admiral, old enough that his uniform no longer fit perfectly, his shoulders narrowed by months of stress, laid out the final projections. "If we continue at this rate," he said, voice flat, "we will not have a functioning fleet in 90 days. Silence. No one argued, because the numbers were merciless. Orion had been spending lives and ships faster than they could replace them. Then a younger strategist, someone who still carried the dangerous energy of desperation, spoke the sentence that changed everything. "What if we stop looking for allies who are already involved and look for someone who isn't?" A few heads turned. Some eyes narrowed. "Neutrals," someone asked. "Independents," the strategist corrected. "Species or factions who stayed out. Powers who haven't been dragged into the blood." Orion leadership had avoided that idea for a reason. Calling neutrals into a war was like inviting fire into your house because you were cold. But desperation does not care about pride. The Coalition spent the next hours drafting a message, something balanced enough to sound dignified, urgent enough to be honest, and vague enough to avoid making promises they couldn't keep. They built it like a net, wide, open, thrown into the galaxy with no certainty anything would come back. It was not addressed to any one nation or leader. It was broadcast on a neutral emergency band, an old diplomatic frequency that most militaries had stopped monitoring because it was known for nothing but pleas and scams. The message had no poetry, no speeches, no medals, just facts. The war had consumed the region. Civilian worlds were being erased. The next phase would spill into neighboring systems. Any independent force willing to stabilize the corridor would be compensated and recognized under galactic neutrality law. At the end, Orion added one line that felt humiliating even as they typed it. "We request assistance." They sent it. And then, like every other day of the war, they waited for impact. For hours, nothing responded. Some small groups offered support, meaning prayers and empty sympathy. A few independent militias asked for impossible payment up front. Several opportunists tried to bargain for Orion territory as a security fee. Orion ignored all of it, because none of it was real help. Then came the 2-day gap. 48 hours in which Orion almost forgot they'd even sent the broadcast, because the Dominion kept pushing. Orion stations kept falling. Orion medics kept triaging people like numbers. The call for help became just another piece of paperwork in the machinery of survival. Until the morning of day 847. A single encrypted packet arrived at Orion Command. It wasn't routed through normal diplomatic channels. It wasn't delivered with ceremony. It simply appeared in a secure inbox. Verified, authenticated, undeniable. At first, Orion officers assumed it was another would-be mercenary. Then they saw the origin tag. Humanity. The room went still. Humans weren't the strongest species in raw fleet count. They weren't the oldest empire. They didn't have the kind of ancient, polished war doctrine that made admirals bow their heads. Humans were unpredictable. They had fought wars among themselves. They had built and broken alliances. They had created technology that seemed too practical to be art and too flexible to be tradition. Humans were known for two contradictory traits. They could be chaotic, and they could be frighteningly organized when they cared. Orion leadership opened the packet. Inside was no negotiation, no demand for tribute, no request for territory, no list of political conditions. Instead, there were 3 items. A set of coordinates, the central corridor where the war's bloodiest supply lines converged. A time schedule, start time, operation window, end time. A single sentence, colder than any threat. "We require 5 hours. Orion leaders reread it, convinced they misunderstood. 5 hours? Not 5 days. Not 5 weeks. 5 hours. One commander let out a sharp laugh that died in his throat. 5 hours to do what? He muttered. Lose with us. But another officer, one who had studied human behavior from afar, didn't laugh. His face had the pale, hollow look of someone recognizing a pattern. Humans don't speak like this when they're asking permission, he said quietly. They speak like this when they've already decided. Orion attempted to reply, to request clarification, to confirm intent. The human response came fast. Do not reposition. Do not engage. Observe. No friendliness. No warmth. It wasn't rude exactly. It was professional, like dealing with a team arriving to stop a disaster, not a political partner joining a war. That tone alone shook Orion Command more than any boastful threat ever could, because it suggested something Orion hadn't felt in years. Control. In the Dominion, the message was intercepted within minutes. Varan intelligence officers carried it into the flagship like a minor annoyance. Orion is calling outsiders, they reported. Desperation. Varan Admiral smiled. Outsiders always came. Outsiders always bled. Outsiders always learned the same lesson. The Dominion does not get tired. When a human identifier appeared, the smile turned into curiosity. Humans were not a myth. Dominion archives contained records. Humans have fought efficiently when cornered, innovated rapidly under pressure, and, most dangerously, refused to accept normal rules when survival was involved. Still, the Dominion dismissed it. Let them enter, one admiral said. We will grind them down like the rest. That confidence lasted until Dominion scouts reported the first human arrivals. They didn't announce themselves with the violent flair of military jumps. They didn't broadcast triumph. They didn't even spread out aggressively. They arrived as if they had a plan that didn't require intimidation. And the Dominion, built on intimidation, did not know how to interpret that. Meanwhile, across neutral worlds, civilian networks buzzed with rumors. Humans had joined Orion. Humans had come to seize the corridor. Humans were bringing secret weapons. Humans were insane to enter this late. But the most chilling rumor was the simplest. Humans asked for 5 hours. On day 847, 5 hours became a countdown even before anything began, because every species understood one universal truth. If someone enters a war that has lasted nearly 3 years and asks for 5 hours, they're not arriving to participate. They're arriving to end something. And just before the scheduled start time, as fleets on both sides hovered in tense readiness, Orion Command received one final human ping. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't reassurance. It was a single line that felt like a door closing. We are beginning. Then the channels went quiet again. Not the ordinary wartime quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a storm holds still for one breath. And everyone realizes the air has changed. At first, nobody believed the reports. Even in a war that had already rewritten every expectation, what the censors were describing sounded wrong. Dominion scouts were the first to notice it. Their long-range arrays picked up movement at the edge of the conflict zone. Slow, controlled, almost polite. The data didn't match known military signatures. No aggressive jump wakes. No shock flares. No violent distortions in space-time that usually screamed warship incoming. Instead, the readings looked closer to industrial traffic. Freighters, construction rigs, survey vessels. That assumption lasted until analysts cross-checked mass, power output, and internal configuration. These are not freighters, a Varan sensor officer said quietly. They are reinforced. Orion scouts confirmed it minutes later. Human ships were entering the war corridor one by one, as if following an invisible road. They didn't form a wedge. They didn't cluster for protection. They didn't take up threatening positions. They simply arrived and stopped. That alone broke every rule of galactic warfare. You never stopped inside an active combat zone. You either advanced or retreated. Stopping meant you were inviting destruction. Yet the human vessels hovered in open space, lights steady, energy signature stable, as if the surrounding fleets didn't exist. From a distance, they looked almost unfinished. Their hulls lacked the sweeping curves of Dominion intimidation design. They had no ornate armor plating like Orion's legacy ships. Instead, they were angular, modular, layered like something meant to be disassembled and reassembled without ceremony. Human ships didn't look like weapons. They looked like tools. Dominion admirals observed from their flagship, waiting for the obvious follow-up, shield flares, weapons charging, a demonstration of force. Nothing came. One admiral laughed. "This is Orion's answer?" he scoffed. "Scrap metal with engines?" Another added, "Perhaps they intend to bore us into surrender." But behind the jokes, something felt off. The human fleet wasn't growing quickly, but it was growing steadily. Every few minutes, another vessel slid into place. Each arrival locked into position relative to the others, forming a pattern that was neither defensive nor offensive. It was structural, as if the ships were components of a larger machine rather than combat units. Then came the next anomaly. Human vessels began deploying equipment. Not drones, not weapons, not mines, but frameworks. Great metallic forms unfolded from cargo bays, expanding outward like ribs or scaffolding. They were geometric, precise, and utterly unfamiliar to every database in the region. The structures didn't glow ominously. They didn't hum with excess energy. They simply existed, floating in space, locking into position. Varan targeting officers try to classify them. Are they shields? No energy signature. Stations? Too light. Traps? Then where are the triggers? Orion commanders were equally confused. Human liaison channels remained silent. No explanation was offered. No coordination requested. The humans weren't asking Orion to fight alongside them. They weren't asking at all. As more frameworks connected, something subtle began to shift. Not visually, not yet, but in the numbers. Navigation computers reported micro-deviations. Thrusters compensated for forces pilots couldn't feel. Space itself seemed to be developing boundaries. A Dominion cruiser fired a low-power probe shot at one of the human structures. It was meant as a test, not an attack. The projectile left the barrel, traveled a few kilometers, then slowed. Not exploded, not deflected. Slowed. It drifted to a stop in empty space, glowing faintly, motionless like an insect trapped in amber. Every bridge went quiet, because weapons didn't stop like that. Not without shields, not without impact, not without explanation. And still, no human response, no warning, no escalation, just continued construction. At that moment, a realization began to creep through both fleets, slow and uncomfortable. The humans were not building defenses. They were building infrastructure. Hour by hour, the frameworks spread outward, connecting into a lattice that stretched across the central corridor. The human ships moved with careful choreography, never colliding, never rushing, adjusting positions with millimeter precision. It looked less like a battle maneuver and more like a city being assembled in vacuum. Dominion Command ordered a stronger test. A destroyer fired a concentrated energy beam directly at one of the human vessels. The beam activated. The emitter charged. The beam never formed. Power drained from the system the moment firing protocols completed, as if the act of aggression itself had been rejected. That was the moment fear arrived. Not as panic, but as clarity. "This isn't jamming," a Dominion engineer whispered. "It's not interference." "What is it, then?" an admiral demanded. The engineer swallowed. "It's limitation." Across Orion lines, similar incidents unfolded. Missiles failed to lock. Cannons refused to discharge. Engines responded, but never exceeded newly imposed thresholds. Human ships, however, moved freely within those same invisible constraints, because they weren't breaking the rules. They had written them. The framework lattice reached critical density at the center of the corridor. Sensors finally revealed what the humans had been assembling. A region of controlled physics. Not a shield bubble, not a weapon field. A redefinition of how motion, energy, and force could behave within a specific volume of space. The war zone had been turned into a system with permissions, and nobody else had admin access. Dominion captains tried to reposition their fleets, spreading out to avoid containment. They couldn't. Every attempt to cross certain invisible thresholds resulted in the same outcome: resistance, slowing, power drain, refusal. The humans hadn't surrounded them. They had shaped the space they occupied. Orion commanders, watching this unfold, felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief because the Dominion advance had stopped cold. Terror because Orion realized they were just as subject to the same constraints. Human ships didn't distinguish friend from foe. They distinguished movement from aggression. One Orion officer finally broke protocol and opened a direct channel to the human fleet. "State your operational intent," he said carefully. The reply came from a calm, synthesized human voice, genderless, neutral, precise. Stabilization. That single word carried more weight than any war speech Orion had heard in years. Stabilization meant no breakthroughs, no heroic charges, no last-minute victories. It meant the war would no longer behave like a war. Dominion leadership began to argue among themselves. Some demanded immediate withdrawal. Others called for full assault before the humans finished whatever they were doing. But time, for the first time in 847 days, was no longer on the Dominion's side. The human fleet completed its lattice. It stopped moving. Human ships powered down to idle levels. Frameworks locked into final position. Energy readings flattened into calm, controlled curves. The battlefield, once a chaos of fire, speed, and death, had become a still diagram. Nothing exploded, nothing advanced, nothing retreated, and that was the most terrifying sight of all. Because in a galaxy that understood power only through destruction, humans had arrived with something far more dangerous: control without violence. By the time the Dominion realized that the human fleet didn't make sense because it was never meant to fight, the war, as everyone understood it, was already over. At exactly the scheduled moment, no countdown, no warning chime, the universe changed its posture. There was no explosion to mark the beginning, no blinding flash, no thunder rolling through space. Just a quiet confirmation on every tactical display, every command screen, every cockpit interface across the war corridor. Status update. Active parameters applied. For a split second, nobody understood what that meant. Then the war tried to move. A Varan interceptor squadron, ordered to probe the human lattice, pushed engines to full burn. Pilots felt the familiar surge as reactors roared to life. Readings spiked exactly as expected, but the stars ahead didn't stretch. The ships accelerated for less than a heartbeat, then slowed, as if flying into invisible mud. Velocity indicators froze at a number far below combat speed. No matter how much power they poured in, the result was the same. Forward motion existed. Momentum did not. On Orion's side, a missile cruiser attempted a routine targeting lock, preparing a defensive spread out of habit more than intent. The lock sequence initiated. Targeting solution calculated. Then the system looped back to start again and again, like a thought that couldn't finish itself. Crew members stared at the console in disbelief. "It's not broken," the weapons officer said. "It's refusing." Across the corridor, similar reports flooded in. Plasma cannons charged, but discharged harmlessly into their own containment fields. Rail weapons engaged, but failed to reach lethal velocity. Fighter craft could maneuver, but only within newly imposed limits that felt arbitrarily strict and strangely precise. This wasn't chaos. It was regulation. Hour one passed in stunned confusion. Veterans, those who had survived hundreds of engagements, described the feeling later as deeply unsettling. Not fear exactly, not relief either. It felt like someone had walked into the battlefield, clapped their hands once, and said, "Enough." Dominion Command scrambled to adapt. They rerouted power, switched to backup systems, authorized manual firing protocols that bypassed automation entirely. Nothing worked. The moment an action crossed from movement into aggression, the system intervened. Not violently, decisively. One Dominion captain ordered a ship to ram an Orion cruiser out of sheer frustration. The two massive vessels surged toward each other, then slowed simultaneously, their approach reduced to a gentle drift that stopped meters apart. They hung there, nose to nose. Enemies who had spent months trying to kill each other now stared across reinforced glass, powerless. The message was unmistakable. You may exist here, you may move here, but you may not destroy. At hour 2, panic tried to take root, but found no oxygen. Because panic requires escalation, and escalation was impossible. Fleets couldn't surge forward. Commanders couldn't order decisive strikes. Even retreat proved complicated, as certain vectors resisted high-speed withdrawal. The war corridor had become a controlled environment. Like a laboratory, human ships remained silent throughout it all. They did not posture. They did not patrol aggressively. They simply observed, adjusted, maintained. Their frameworks pulsed faintly now, not with raw power, but with consistency. Every pulse reinforced the same invisible laws. Dominion scientists began piecing it together. This isn't suppression, one analyst said, voice tight. It's prioritization. What does that mean? An admiral demanded. It means the system allows actions that preserve stability and rejects actions that increase entropy. The admiral frowned. In plain language, the analyst swallowed. It lets you exist. It won't let you fight. That realization hit like a hammer. The Dominion had built its identity on the certainty that force solved problems. Their fleets were optimized for overwhelming violence, for pushing until something broke. Now, they were trapped inside a space that simply would not break. At hour 2.5, the first unauthorized broadcast went out. Not from leadership, but from a Dominion pilot who couldn't hold it in anymore. "We can't do anything," he said, voice cracking. "We're not damaged. We're not destroyed. We're just stopped." The transmission spread. So did the fear. On Orion worlds, civilians watched in disbelief as live feeds showed enemy fleets immobilized without being annihilated. People who had spent years bracing for extinction didn't know how to react to survival that arrived quietly. Some cried. Some prayed. Some didn't trust it at all. Because miracles that don't demand payment feel suspicious to those who have paid everything already. At hour 3, the humans finally spoke again. The message appeared everywhere at once, identical across languages and formats. Phase 1 complete. That was it. No celebration. No explanation. Phase 1 what? The answer came not through words, but through effect. The lattice expanded, not outward explosively, but methodically, locking additional sectors into the same controlled state. Systems that had been staging grounds for reinforcements suddenly found their fleets unable to jump at combat speeds. Supply lines froze. Not cut, frozen. Dominion admirals realized the horrifying truth. Even if they wanted to continue the war elsewhere, the engine of conflict had stalled. You can't fight without movement. You can't invade without momentum. You can't terrorize when terror refuses to propagate. The war wasn't being beaten. It was being starved. Orion Command finally understood why humans hadn't asked for trust or coordination. Because trust was irrelevant. This system didn't rely on belief or cooperation. It relied on physics. And physics does not negotiate. By the end of hour 3, something unprecedented occurred. Across both fleets, weapons crews stood down. Not because they were ordered to, but because there was nothing left for them to do. Pilots powered systems to minimum. Engineers stopped emergency reroutes. The noise level aboard ships dropped. The war, so loud it had reshaped cultures, had been muted, not ended, muted. And in that unnatural quiet, an even deeper realization began to surface among commanders on both sides. If humans could do this here, they could do it anywhere, which meant the balance of power in the galaxy hadn't just shifted. It had been redefined. Hour 1 had been confusion. Hour 2 had been fear. Hour 3 brought understanding. And understanding was far more dangerous than panic. Because now, every species watching knew the same thing. The war wasn't being paused for negotiation. It was being paused so everyone could see, clearly, unmistakably, what fighting looks like when it is no longer allowed. By hour 4, the truth could no longer be avoided. The Varan Dominion was not losing ships. They were losing certainty. For generations, Dominion doctrine had been built on a single, unshakable belief. Pressure wins wars. Push harder, longer, and faster than your enemy until resistance collapses. Every campaign, every training program, every fleet design followed that logic. Now, they were inside a space where pressure meant nothing. Dominion admirals tried to pretend otherwise. On their flagship, voices rose, overlapping in sharp commands and countercommands. Tactical maps refreshed again and again, as if new data might magically unlock a solution. Shift to auxiliary drives. Reroute power through independent coils. Authorize kinetic-only maneuvers. Attempt synchronized thrust. Each order was executed perfectly. Each order failed identically. The ships responded. The crews performed. The machines obeyed. Reality did not. The lattice didn't jam systems. It didn't corrupt software. It didn't disable reactors. It simply enforced limits so cleanly that there was nothing to fight against. And that was the Dominion's weakness. They knew how to battle enemies. They did not know how to battle boundaries. A senior Dominion strategist finally spoke the words no one wanted to hear. "This is not a military engagement anymore," she said. "It's containment." The room went quiet. Containment was something the Dominion did to others: rebellions, outbreaks, populations deemed unstable. It was never something done to them. An admiral slammed a clawed fist into the console. "Then we break containment." "How?" the strategist asked calmly. No one answered. Because breaking containment requires leverage, and the Dominion had none. No threat could be carried out. No escalation could force a response. Even the concept of retaliation had been neutralized. Worse still, the humans weren't issuing demands. There was no enemy voice to argue with. No ultimatum to resist. Just silence. And silence is unbearable to an empire that defines itself through command. Then came the moment that truly cracked the Dominion's resolve. A human transmission appeared, brief, precise, impossible to misinterpret. Exit lane established. Tactical displays updated instantly. A single corridor through the lattice glowed faintly, its boundaries clearly marked. Unlike the rest of the sealed zone, this path allowed higher velocity, stable navigation, and unrestricted movement. It led away from the conflict zone, not toward Orion worlds, not toward Dominion targets. Away. Dominion officers stared at it, confused. "This is a trap," one said immediately. "It has to be." But sensor data contradicted him. The lane was clean, stable, safe. Every simulation showed it functioning exactly as advertised. Orion Command saw it too, and held their breath. Because if this was a trap, it was a strange one. There were no weapons lining the corridor, no kill zones, no ambush signatures, no hidden energy spikes, just an open path labeled in simple, universal language. Exit. The meaning hit the Dominion fleet like a physical blow. This wasn't surrender being demanded. This was withdrawal being permitted. The humans weren't trying to humiliate the Dominion. They weren't demanding apology or tribute. They were offering something far more dangerous to an empire built on pride. A way out that didn't involve defeat by force. Dominion leadership argued fiercely. Some called it a deception meant to isolate ships one by one. Others insisted that accepting it would signal weakness to every subject world watching. But the arguments grew weaker with each passing minute. Because Hour 4 brought consequences. Supply vessels stranded outside the lattice could not reach the front. Reinforcements queued at jump points, unable to enter combat space at effective speed. Communication lag increased as relay traffic rerouted around controlled regions. The Dominion war machine, so carefully optimized, was beginning to stall. And the longer it stalled, the more visible that stall became to the galaxy. Neutral systems watched in real time. Subjugated worlds watched closely. Rivals took notes. The Dominion had always projected inevitability. Now inevitability was slipping. A junior officer, trembling but honest, voiced the question everyone was avoiding. What happens if we stay? The answer was obvious and terrifying. Nothing. No battles. No victories. No heroic losses. Just immobilized fleets burning resources, draining morale, and broadcasting impotence across every channel. An empire can survive defeat. It cannot survive irrelevance. At 4:11 Standard Galactic Time, a single Dominion cruiser made a decision. Without authorization, it turned toward the exit lane and accelerated. Every I tracked it, the ship crossed the boundary. Nothing happened. No explosion. No shutdown. No retaliation. The cruiser accelerated smoothly, slipping through the corridor and out of the controlled zone. It lived. The bridge of the Dominion flagship erupted. Recall them. Hold position. Form ranks. But the spell was broken. Another cruiser followed. Then a squadron. Then an entire wing. Each ship that exited carried the same message back through the fleet. Not through words, but through proof. You can leave. Human ships did not pursue. Orion ships did not fire. The lattice did not collapse. It simply held its shape, patient and unmoved. Dominion captains faced a choice that none of their training had prepared them for. Fight and be unable to fight, or leave and survive. By the midpoint of Hour 4, organized resistance had dissolved into calculation. Admirals stopped issuing attack orders and started issuing withdrawal protocols. Not surrender, withdrawal, because no declaration had been made and none was required. This was not a victory parade for Orion. It was a structural failure for the Dominion, and failures like that echo for generations. On Orion command decks, officers watched the retreat with disbelief. Some expected a trap at any moment. Some waited for a last desperate strike. None came, because desperation needs hope, and the Dominion had run out of it. At 4:52, Dominion High Command transmitted a message, not to the humans, but to its own fleets. All units authorized to disengage via designated corridor. That single line marked the end of something far larger than a battle. It marked the end of the Dominion's belief that war was always an option. The last Dominion ship exited the controlled zone seconds before Hour 5. Behind them, the battlefield remained intact. No wreckage fields, no fresh graves, no victory debris, just quiet space. Human ships remained in position, still silent, still neutral. They had not destroyed the Dominion. They had shown it something worse. A future where force was no longer guaranteed to matter. As Hour 4 closed, Orion commanders realized something unsettling. The war hadn't ended because one side won. It had ended because one side chose to stop and discovered it had no way to continue. And that realization would haunt the Dominion far longer than any defeat ever could. Because empires recover from losses. They do not recover easily from being shown that their favorite weapon has been rendered obsolete. Hour 5 did not arrive like the ending of a war. It arrived like the ending of a storm, slow enough that you only notice it once you can hear your own breathing again. The last Dominion ships slipped through the exit corridor in a steady stream. Engines humming at controlled speeds, hull lights dimmed, crews silent. Some vessels carried damage from earlier days, patched with desperate welds and temporary plating. Others were pristine, never hit, never tested, because for hours they had been unable to fire a single meaningful shot. The Dominion didn't retreat in chaos. They retreated in disbelief, because what they had encountered wasn't a superior fleet. It was a superior decision. As the exit lane emptied, the battlefield settled into something the galaxy had almost forgotten existed. Stillness. Not the stillness of death. Not the stillness of empty space. The stillness of conflict that has been forced to stop moving. Orion Command watched from their central station, waiting for the inevitable twist. They had lived too long inside fear to trust quiet. Every officer had a reflex for betrayal. Every strategist expected the Dominion to fake withdrawal and strike the moment Orion relaxed. But the strike never came, because it couldn't, and because, perhaps the first time, the Dominion understood that this time, escalation would only humiliate them further. At 5 o'clock exactly, the humans transmitted again. No flourish, no anthem, no victory phrase. Just one word, brief enough to miss if you blinked, heavy enough to change history. And, on every display, the operational timer stopped. Operation window, complete. The lattice did not vanish. It did not explode outward. It did not power down dramatically. It simply remained, quietly enforcing the same invisible laws. Weapons stayed muted. High-speed combat acceleration stayed restricted. Aggressive targeting stayed non-functional. The corridor was still a controlled space, but now it was empty of intent. Orion officers asked the question they had carried like a stone for years. Is it over? No one answered, because no one knew what over meant anymore. Over meant winning. Over meant surrender. Over meant bodies, wreckage, victory speeches. This had none of those. Then an Orion diplomat, newly appointed because the old ones had died or quit, did something unthinkable. He opened a channel, public, neutral, and addressed the humans directly. His voice shook, but he forced it steady. Humanity, he said, state your objective. Are you declaring intervention, occupation, enforcement? What is your claim here? For several seconds, there was only static. Then the human response arrived, calm, clinical, almost gentle in its clarity. We have no claim. We are stabilizing the region. Fighting will not resume here. It was not a demand. It was a statement of fact, delivered the way one might say, gravity will remain in effect. That tone, so simple, so unquestioning, hit Orion Command with mixed emotions. Relief, yes, but also a deeper, more complicated fear. If humans could do this without asking, what else could they do? Orion's admiral, exhausted and sharp-edged, stepped forward and spoke the truth Orion leadership had been too proud to admit. Why, he asked. Why now? Why us? Why after 847 days? The human reply took longer this time, as if the speaker was choosing words that wouldn't be misunderstood. Because it reached the threshold. Because the war would spread. Because your request became a warning. Orion officers exchanged glances. A request became a warning. It meant humanity hadn't joined because Orion was righteous. Humanity joined because the war had become dangerous to everyone. Not morally dangerous, structurally dangerous. Like a reactor about to breach. On Dominion channels, far beyond the lattice, Varan leadership held emergency sessions. Their fleets had withdrawn, but their reputation had not escaped untouched. Across the galaxy, systems that once trembled under Dominion's shadow now watched with something new in their eyes. Possibility. The Dominion tried to frame it publicly as strategic repositioning. They issued statements about temporary operational adjustments. No one believed them. Not after the exit lane. Not after the 5-hour shutdown. Not after being shown that their most sacred weapon, violence, could be made irrelevant by someone who didn't even fire a shot. Within days, delegates from neutral worlds began arriving in human space. Some came to congratulate. Some came to plead. Some came to protest, calling it interference. But the human position remained consistent. They did not claim to be rulers. They claimed to be engineers of stability. Behind the scenes, Orion requested a direct meeting. Not a broadcast, not a message, a face-to-face exchange. The humans agreed, on the condition that no military officers attend. Only negotiators, only planners, only those willing to speak without threats. When Orion heard that condition, they almost didn't know how to respond. Because Orion had forgotten how to exist without soldiers leading the room. The first meeting took place in a neutral station near the control corridor. Orion diplomats entered cautiously, expecting the usual intimidation tactics. Armed guards, aggressive posture, psychological pressure. Instead, the human delegation arrived with no visible weapons. They wore simple uniforms, practical fabrics, minimal insignia. Their eyes weren't cold, but they were focused, as if they were here to solve a problem, not perform dominance. The Orion lead negotiator began with gratitude, words spilling out like someone who had held them too long. You saved us, he said. You stopped them. A human representative, raised a hand, stopping him gently. We did not save you, the human said. We paused the destruction. What happens next is yours. That sentence became the most uncomfortable truth Orion had faced since the war began. Because if the war could no longer continue by force, then Orion would have to confront its own choices, its own grudges, its own desire for revenge. Peace is not a gift. It is responsibility. Orion asked the next question, the one everyone feared. How long will the corridor remain controlled? The human replied, without hesitation. As long as necessary. There was again that calm certainty. Not arrogance, not menace. Just inevitability. Like a door that would not reopen until people proved they wouldn't burn the house down again. The galaxy reacted in waves. Some celebrated humans as saviors. Some accused them of tyranny. Some demanded access to the technology, fearing any species that could rewrite the rules of conflict. Humans denied most requests. They did not share lattice designs. They did not sell containment frameworks. They did not license war-ending systems. Instead, they offered something far less exciting and far more radical. A set of negotiation protocols, a monitoring network, a neutral arbitration process, tools to prevent wars, not end them with a spectacle. To many civilizations, that was disappointing. They want a weapon. Humans offered a structure. And that, in the long run, was the point. Weeks later, the war corridor became something new, a demilitarized passage where trade convoys cautiously returned, escorted not by fleets but by neutrality monitors. Wreckage was collected. Stations were rebuilt. Survivors were rescued from drifting pods that had been lost for months. The galaxy saw something it hadn't seen in years. Repair crews, not soldiers. And yet, even as life returned, everyone remembered the 5 hours. Not because of what was destroyed, but because of what wasn't. No planet was glassed during those hours. No last stand massacre occurred. No final battle carved its name into history with blood. Instead, history recorded 5 hours of silence. A silence so loud it forced two empires to listen. And in that silence, the galaxy learned a lesson it would never unlearn. When humans finally entered the war, they didn't arrive to fight like everyone else. They arrived to change the rules, so fighting wasn't the default anymore. They didn't win a war. They made war impossible until everyone could remember what it felt like to choose something else. And long after fleets moved on, long after politics rewrote the narratives, the stars over that corridor still held the same quiet warning, like a sign posted across the universe. Violence is not always an option. Not anymore.